Welcome to the Dairy News and Views podcast, a production of the Iowa State University Extension and Outreach Dairy Team. Our podcast covers current educational, research, and industry tools available for your operation to manage healthy cows and calves while producing the highest quality dairy products.
Thanks for joining us today on Dairy News and Views from Iowa State University Dairy Team. I'm Fred Hall, Northwest Iowa Dairy Field Specialist, and I'm here with Jen Bentley, the Northeast Iowa Dairy Specialist, as we discuss today's topic. Welcome back to the podcast, Jen.
The weather is shaping up. It was a little cold here this week, and things are starting to green up here in Northeast Iowa. How are things looking in Northwest?
Well, things are shaping up. We had a little bit of mist this morning, but there's a lot of planters rolling through the fields this week. This week, we invited Northwest Iowa field agronomist Joel DeJong to our monthly webinar series to cover the upcoming first cutting of alfalfa and management tips to maximize quality. Joel has over 20 years of experience working closely with farmers on integrated management of pest populations, crop management issues, and nutrient and manure management planning, and oversees annual pesticide applicator continuing education sessions, focusing on environmental risks, safety, and proper integrated pest management. In addition, Joe also trains company agronomists on research-based crop production practices and teaches certified crop advisors on production, nutrient, and pest management issues. Welcome to our podcast, Joel.
Well, Fred, it's a pleasure to be here. You too, Jen. I'm looking forward to it today, and I hope people learn from what we discuss.
Great to have you on, Joel. And in addition, we also invited our Northeast Iowa field agronomist, Josh Michel, to join the discussion as he'll be keeping our peak website up to date and monitoring fields as we near our first alfalfa cutting. Josh recently moved to Northeast Iowa after being the ISU Extension and Outreach field agronomist in Southern Iowa for the past 3 years. And prior to that, Josh worked with the ISU Research and Demonstration Farms. So welcome also to Josh to our podcast.
Thanks, Jennifer. Thanks for inviting me. Pleasure to be here as well.
Joel, as we head out of winter and into spring, how do we evaluate alfalfa stands for winter injury?
Well, Fred, that's a great question. As we get into alfalfa production, if we want to be good at it, we have to start with the plant food making factory first, and that's the alfalfa plants. So what I often do and what Iowa State recommends is fairly early in April as we start green up, have a tool out there that's a square foot measuring area. I use PVC pipe that I've got glued together in a square foot, and I want something heavy enough I can throw, but also so I can see it when I throw it. I used to use a piece of wire, and then every once in a while I have to spend a lot of time looking for that wire that I'd be thrown on in the field for evaluation. What I use it for is to evaluate how many crowns that we have per square foot, and or a little later in the season, how many stems per square foot that we have out there. So early in the season, if you're trying to make that decision of do we need to add more acres just because this one didn't overwinter very well, we'll start doing some some crown counts early. So I'll take that 1 square foot area and I'll throw it in several directions, and I'll go dig how many crowns are out there. I'll split them in half and I'll take a look at color. Do they have that nice creamy white color? Are they really yellowing and looking pretty tough? The second thing is, how much damage do we have to the crown? Is it more than 50% damage? So that one's not one that might much make it past the first cutting. So we get concerned about those. And ideally, what we're looking for early in the season is, if it's the second year after seeding, we're looking at least 8 crowns per square foot, ideally. The third year after, we're looking at least 6, and 4-year older stands, we're looking at 4. We're looking at crowns that are fairly uniformly round or showing some evidence of fairly uniform, round, balanced growth instead of just maybe a little bit on one side and not much on the other. And that's what we're looking for. If we have a marginal stand, year 2, we're looking at 5 to 6, year 3, 4 to 5. year 4 and older, 3 to 4, we probably are losing some yield at that case. But if they're really good, healthy crowns, we can probably continue. Now, my preference is to go a little later in the season. When we've got that growth big enough, we can actually count stems. And Wisconsin's data says, we want 55 stems per square foot on average if we can get it. That's a really good stand. 40 to 55 probably costs us some yield, but we still should get pretty good production out of that mix. And if we're not getting 40 stems per square foot, we're really working in a situation where we've reduced that yield pretty significantly. And we might really want to consider moving that into a rotation and then reseeding some new alfalfa.
So Joel and Josh, you're both on both parts of the states here and probably see varying things that are happening out in the fields as you kind of take a look at those. Have you seen any signs for a potential injury to stands this week? And if there have been any damages, what are some next steps that producers might have to do with that?
Jen, great question. The cooler temperatures may have provided an opportunity for a few stands to maybe have just a little bit of cold weather injury. There are a couple of things that we should definitely be looking for. First, if there's less than 30% of the stem tops that are showing some signs of wilting or browning from some frost, you don't have to do anything. There's enough stems that are remaining to provide enough good growth and yield for that first cutting. The stand might have some yield reduction of that first cutting, but it's going to recover completely on that second cutting, so you should be fine. Second thing to consider, if most or all of those stem tops are damaged and the stand is less than 10 inches tall, again, you don't have to do anything. The growing points have been killed, but the alfalfa will form some new buds at some lower leaf junctions that would also be called auxiliary buds. And those will continue to grow. That first cutting might be a little bit delayed, but alfalfa does do a good job of having some horizontal growth, and mowing existing top growth also isn't going to enhance any of that recovery. So you can continue as normal, and that would be fine. Now, the third thing that you should consider, if your stand is over 12 inches tall, you should go ahead and harvest that stand. What's done is going to be done, but as soon as you can get that top growth off that has been damaged and you allow that stand to start regrowing, the sooner you can do that, the better off you're going to be.
What I observed in Northwest Iowa in the last couple of mornings was we definitely had frost. We had temperatures in the mid-teens. In the morning, you could see the frost on the plants. You could see the tops wilted over. But when I was looking at them kind of late yesterday afternoon again, we saw a little bit of leaf damage, but it didn't look like we killed the primary buds. The alfalfa here is only about 5 inches tall, 4 to 5 inches tall. So we wouldn't be using cutting as an option anyway, but I think we actually just snuck by. It doesn't look like we killed the primary growth, and it looks like it's going to continue recovering right up the middle, which won't slow our growth down any more than the cold weather already had. Now, I would also note that if you had new seeding that was already emerged, and I'm not aware of any over here, but if you did, those temperatures probably took out that new seeding. But again, you need to look at those fields, preferably 3-4 days after that last frost, to find out the total extent of damage.
Okay, let's talk a little bit about what are the top producers doing to maximize forage quality and quantity. What are they particularly paying attention to?
So, Fred, there's a couple things that top producers can do to maximize forage quality and quantity. One of the best things they can do early on is taking some really good soil samples, get an idea of what our nutrient levels are like in those soils, what those reservoirs look like, and then being able to correct for any nutrient deficiencies. One big thing is also paying attention to your phosphorus and your potassium removal rates. Most producers are unaware just how much potassium especially gets removed every time we do take a cutting. And if you're able to help replenish some of those removal rates, that can really greatly help out and assist that alfalfa rebound after those cuttings and set yourself up for success really well throughout the year. Another thing that you can do is scout regularly. What I mean by that is scout regularly for any type of alfalfa pests, whether we're talking early in the season or later in the season, but also be mindful of what those insect thresholds are. If you do get to a point where thresholds are being reached, then it may be time to consider applying a foliar fungicide. Otherwise, most cases, if we're under those thresholds, usually stepping up that harvest or that cutting a couple of days may also take care of that issue as well. So I would say just being aware of what's going on out there, being observant, and having some timely scoutings can go an awful long ways.
Yeah, I agree with Josh. To me, a lot of the really good producers in my region are the ones that really pay attention to the soil fertility side and managing the phosphorus and potash. I think that's a big one. And sometimes it gets neglected, mostly because can be such a high cash flow item, because we remove an incredible amount of potash if we've got really good yields, and it's hard for people to keep up with, or even to think about keeping up with that. The other side is making sure that we have good stands. So that means really good seeding procedures, good firm soil seed beds, timing, and all those things. So we establish a good stand, and then monitor that stand at the beginning of every year to make sure we've got adequate numbers of stems, like we just talked about. And then being willing to pull the trigger and move on to the rotating it, instead of trying to allow it to buy another year or 2 years, even when we've got marginal stands. The ones that are really trying to produce high amounts of product actually do pay closer attention, are willing to rotate a little quicker. And I know that's tough to do because seed price is so high, but that's one of those things that really helps in the production side. Plus, Josh's scouting for diseases, for insects, very critical, and in timely management at harvest time. All of those are part of the mix.
Yeah, you both brought up some good points. And, Josh mentioned the foliar fungicide applications. And I know there's been some research done at the National Research Farm. Can you kind of summarize what those treatments were and what the best return to producers' investment would be on those?
Well, there was actually about 4 different studies that I spent a little time on. One of them is a best management practices study that looked at several different treatments. One was following Iowa State soil fertility recs, plus using insect management kind of as the baseline one. And then they added things like putting an additional 25% fertilizer on there. They added things like using fungicides. They added things like foliar feeding. They added another one using a product called Bioforge, which is supposed to be a stress reducer for the crop. And what we saw in the mix was, when we looked at basic production of using an insecticide plus the Iowa State soil fertility recs, that one was probably the most profitable. Using a fungicide, because you don't always get a response to the fungicide, was probably the next most profitable one. We saw some really nice responses to fungicides at times. Timely insecticide use definitely paid off, because we had one treatment without it, and that was the lowest producing one. And then the other thing we learned was that the foliar feeding didn't really help us, because our soil test levels were in the medium category, and we didn't see any addition to the Bioforge product that was used out there. So some of those treatments applied properly can give us some help. Also, another study looked at what's the right timing for getting that applied, and it looked to be the 6 to 8 inch height for the fungicides and some of those other things. There were differences between varieties. That was a different study of using the fungicides, but there were several things. If we have high valued hay, again, a different study looking at the fungicides itself that was conducted over 6 years. If you had high value hay, it paid in most cases on average to treat the fungicide with nearly every cutting. If it was 100, instead of $200 a ton hay, it was $140 a ton hay, then mostly the best bang for your buck was by far for the first cutting. And if you only had $80 hay, then it probably didn't pay that well to get it done. But, there were some really good responses to fungicide use. And early in the season is when we seem to see most leaf diseases. So that first cutting is easily where you get the biggest bang for your buck, or at least the highest chances for getting a good return on your investment.
What might be some of those common leaf diseases that, early on we should be taking a look at and then making that decision on those treatments?
Yeah, Jen, there's a few different early season leaf diseases that are out there that we do need to keep an eye on. The most common spring leaf diseases that we come across are spring black stem, downy mildew, and leaf spot. And there's a couple different varieties of leaf spot that are out there, but they all look pretty similar. Now, when we're talking about scouting for leaf diseases, there's a couple things to keep in mind. If an alfalfa field is in the later stages of regrowth, and if a leaf disease is present and you think you're going to have some significant leaf drop, it's likely, I would advise move that harvest up as soon as you can to avoid some of that leaf drop. It's probably not going to be worthwhile to apply a foliar fungicide. Now, let's say if an alfalfa field is in the early stages of regrowth, and if a leaf disease is evident and the yield potential is really good, things that Joel just talked about previously, especially you have some really good high quality hay, prices are good. If your yield potential is looking really good, then you might consider applying a foliar fungicide. If the weather forecast predicts above average rainfall and the yield potential again is good, that's also a situation where considering applying a foliar fungicide might be a good idea.
For many years, retired field agronomist Brian Lang headed up the statewide peak reporting site. Tell us what peak means and how it relates to cutting time and quality for this first cutting of alfalfa.
Fred, that's a great question. So PEAQ, or PEAQ, stands for Predictive Equations for Alfalfa Quality. This is a method that uses the stand height of alfalfa and its maturity stage to get a really good estimate of the relative feed value, or RFV, of the crop. Now, there's a couple things to keep in mind when we're talking about estimating RFV based on peak. Typically, the RFV of the first crop alfalfa will decline 3 to 5 points every day as that crop matures. As you think about that crop maturing, it usually doesn't pay out to wait a few more days for stem elongation for that crop to get higher, because like I mentioned, every day that crop still stands out there, you're potentially losing 3 to 5 points at the same time. Now, under the best conditions also, there's a good chance you're going to lose 10 up to 20% of that forage dry matter during harvest. This can amount to 15 RFV points for haylage and up to 25 RFV points when you're harvesting it for hay. Now, when we're talking about minimum quality RFVs, when we're talking about harvesting for lactating dairy cows, you really want to be at least 150 RFV points. So if your target is 150 and you could be losing anywhere from 15 to 25 RFV points per day, you really want to try to shoot or target of harvesting that alfalfa crop when those peak measurements are in the range of 165 to 175. So just some different things to keep in mind.
And Josh will be coordinating the peak reporting site for us now, coordinating different sites across the state where we can plug in those numbers. Of course, probably is still a good idea for farms to evaluate their own stands because every field is going to be different. But can you tell us where we can go to view that peak reporting site?
Jen, yeah, you made a great comment there about farmers should take the time to evaluate their own stands. There are a number of extension and outreach field specialists across the state that are going to be monitoring and submitting some peak estimates. And the best place to find that can be found on the ISU Extension and Outreach Dairy Team website. If you scroll all the way down to the bottom on the right-hand side, you'll see there's a link for peak, and it kind of has a little small calculator symbol next to it. That's an easy way to remember it. If you click on that link, you'll see where a number of different ISU Extension Outreach field specialists all around the state will be submitting some observations and estimates from peak on all the neighboring alfalfa fields and several counties around the state. But again, that's just a guideline, and fields can vary even within one county to the next. So use it as a guideline. I would also caution farmers to make sure that they go out and also take some estimates in their own fields. It's a real simple, easy thing to do. It doesn't take a whole lot of time. And there are some really good resources on that peak reporting page as well. One of those resources is a peak fact sheet that takes you through the real simple, easy process of doing it. It only takes about 5 minutes per field to do, and it's something very simple and very, again, easy to do.
Years ago, I got a yardstick that actually had the peak numbers already on it. Are those still available?
Fred, that's a great question. I really don't know. I think it's a great idea.
Otherwise, I'm going to put mine up on the shelf and protect it if it's an antique. I don't know.
Well, it's a great idea. I was at a lumber yard yesterday and I was looking, They didn't have yardsticks, but I thought about just grabbing some 1x1s and making some lines on it. And if you had a 1x1, 4 sides, you could use 3 of those sides and you could color coordinate them to, all right, this is a vegetative stage, this is bud stage, this is flowering stage. And you could just turn it to whatever your height is and you'd have your estimates right there.
That's exactly what this one is. You just kind of turn it to what fits the plants you're looking at.
I would try the National Alfalfa and Forage Alliance, see if they have them, because if I remember right, that's where they came from.
And Joel, you had referenced some great resources during our webinar. Would you mind recapping those resources?
Oh, I certainly can, Jan. One I didn't talk about that I don't really share with the public, but is really great for me is we talked about Brian Lang, the retired field agronomist in Northeast Iowa. He was kind enough when he retired to leave all of us a treasure trove of alfalfa management materials. And so I've mined that pretty heavily over the years, and I'll continue to mine it as we move forward because he really put together a lot of good information for us. But for others that are growing alfalfa, a few references that I use a lot are, one is the Alfalfa Analyst. It's a booklet that I got from the National Alfalfa and Forage Alliance. So do a Google search for that. You can find it. I think it only costs about $2. That's a great reference. If you're planning on seeding, they also have another publication on there and variety ratings for winter injury and disease resistance, et cetera. So there's a whole bunch of very good reference materials from the National Alfalfa and Forage Alliance. One of those books that usually travels in my vehicle is called the Alfalfa Management Guide. That comes from the American Society of Agronomy. That's probably about a 40 or 50 page book. It's got lots of disease symptoms and everything else on management in it. Another very useful reference for me. I, of course, as an Iowa Stater, I'm looking for data from Iowa State all the time. I'll often go to the Integrated Crop Management website. That's kind of our crops virtual newsletter that we publish, and then use the search engine to find alfalfa topics. And I can often find answers when I'm looking for them there. Plus, Wisconsin has a Team Forage webpage. And Wisconsin, of course, being very forage invested, has a lot of great information that I quote unquote steal quite frequently and use for helping our clients here in Iowa. So there's several really good references that are university and research based you can find useful while you're making those alfalfa decisions.
Jen, a few other resources I would also mention to what Joel already has. The ISU Extension and Outreach Dairy Team website and page, they have many resources there that are very helpful. The ISU Extension and Outreach Crops Team pages, those also have many links to several good resources. I would also mention the Midwest Forage Association. They have some good information, as well as the Iowa Forage and Grassland Council. There's some good resources there as well.
I'll add one more. The Iowa Beef Center also has some, particularly on the silage or that type of topic. There's several resource pieces there too. So it's probably more than you're going to remember. Find your favorites, get them ordered, have them at hand, use them during the season as you're making decisions. Or, hey, call your extension field agronomist. We'll be glad to work with you also.
I do have that Alfalfa Management Guide pocketbook as well, and I find that very handy. It's small enough that I can keep in the car, and if you're traveling along and observing, you can quickly flip to those pictures. So it's very good to kind of reference that.
Well, I had one, but I lent it to somebody and I can't find it back, so I need to order another.
I carry mine with me as well. It's a very simple, handy little book to have. Probably one of the most user-friendly ones as well.
I do want to note that the webinar Joel presented this week is posted on our Extension Dairy Team website, and we'll include the link with this recorded podcast to those who want to get further viewing and further information. Thanks for being on this podcast today, Joel and Josh.
It's a pleasure. I hope you, whoever's listening, finds it useful. And again, give us a holler if you need some additional assistance.
Thanks, Fred. Thanks, Jen. We appreciate you reaching out to us and being able to be a part of this as well.
Thanks for joining us today, and we look forward to visiting with you on the next Dairy News and Views from ISU.
This institution is an equal opportunity provider. For the full non-discrimination statement or combination inquiries, go to www.extension.iastate.edu/diversity/ext.